He first noticed the dust before noticing the silence. It hung thick in the stale air of the abandoned cabin, swirling lazily through cracks in the boarded windows, like memories searching for somewhere to settle. Thomas wiped sweat from his weathered forehead, the late spring heat clinging to him despite the shade. His muscles ached from hours of hauling rotted furniture and debris from what used to be his grandfather's hunting retreat. A place that had stood empty for nearly 17 years, forgotten by everyone except the forest slowly reclaiming it. He paused, leaning against a splintered doorframe, listening to the strange quiet that fills places where people once laughed and argued and lived. His border collie, a clever dog named Maggie with mismatched eyes, one brown and one blue, sniffed cautiously through the wreckage, her tail low but curious. She had that way of moving through uncertain spaces, careful but brave, as though she understood that some places held stories too heavy for careless steps. Thomas had inherited this land after his grandfather passed, along with the cabin that sat crooked and defiant at the edge of the property line, buried beneath overgrown brambles and decades of neglect. He hadn't wanted to deal with it, hadn't wanted to face the memories attached to this place, memories of a man who had been stern and distant, who spoke more to trees than to family. But debt has a way of forcing decisions. The farmland needed clearing, the cabin needed demolishing or repairing, and Thomas needed to decide which ghosts he was willing to confront. He chose repair, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was guilt, maybe it was simply that tearing something down felt too much like giving up, and he'd already given up on too many things in his 38 years. The main room of the cabin was chaos, layers of abandonment stacked like sediment. Broken chairs, mildewed blankets, newspapers yellowed beyond recognition, jars filled with unidentifiable remnants of food or preserves that had turned to something dark and unsettling. Maggie kept her distance from those jars, ears flicking nervously whenever Thomas moved them. He worked methodically, sorting what could be salvaged from what needed burning, his mind drifting between the task and the strange unease that had settled over him since stepping inside. The cabin felt watched, though he knew that was ridiculous. Old places always felt that way, holding on to the presence of those who lived there, refusing to let go completely. He told himself it was just the weight of memories, the residue of his grandfather's solitary years spent here, hunting and drinking and hiding from whatever demons he carried. By mid-afternoon, Thomas had cleared most of the main room, revealing floorboards so warped they groaned underfoot. He knelt to examine a particularly damaged section near the stone fireplace, pressing his palm against the wood to test its stability. It gave slightly, creaking with age and rot. He'd need to replace at least half the floor if he wanted this place livable again. The thought exhausted him. Maggie wandered closer, sniffing at the fireplace, her nose twitching rapidly. She pawed at the base of the stones, whining softly, a sound she made when something puzzled her. Thomas frowned, watching her. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse and dust. The dog scratched more insistently at a particular stone, low and slightly recessed, almost hidden beneath layers of soot and grime. Thomas crawled closer, curiosity overriding his exhaustion. He brushed his fingers across the stone Maggie indicated, feeling something unusual beneath the filth. A seam, perhaps, or a crack that didn't match the others. He grabbed a rusted poker from beside the fireplace and carefully pried at the stone's edge. It shifted easier than expected, loosening with a soft grinding sound that made his heart quicken inexplicably. Maggie backed away slightly, tail tucked, watching him with those unsettling, mismatched eyes. He worked the stone free, dust cascading around his hands, and pulled it away to reveal a small hollow, carved deliberately into the space behind it. His breath caught. Something rested inside, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, darkened and stiff with age. Thomas reached in slowly, fingers trembling slightly, though he couldn't explain why. The package was smaller than his hand, surprisingly heavy for its size. He lifted it carefully, feeling the weight settle into his palm like something significant, something that demanded respect. Maggie inched closer again, sniffing cautiously, but not touching. Thomas unwrapped the cloth with meticulous care, peeling back layers that crumbled slightly at his touch. What emerged made him freeze completely, his mind struggling to process what he saw. A cross, roughly the length of his hand from wrist to fingertips, crafted from metal that looked like tarnished silver but felt wrong somehow, too dense, too cold despite the warm air. Intricate engravings covered its surface, symbols and patterns he didn't recognize, worn smooth in places by time or handling. It looked ancient, far older than the cabin, far older than anything his grandfather should have possessed. He turned it slowly in his hands, studying the craftsmanship, the strange beauty of it despite the grime. Then his thumb brushed across the center of the cross, where the vertical and horizontal beams intersected, and everything changed. Light erupted from the metal, not bright enough to hurt his eyes, but unmistakable, impossible, a soft golden glow that pulsed beneath his skin like a heartbeat. Thomas jerked backward, dropping the cross onto the floorboards where it clattered and continued to shine, illuminating the dim cabin with warm, flickering radiance. Maggie yelped and scrambled to the far corner, barking sharply, her hackles raised. Thomas stared at the glowing object, his heart hammering against his ribs, every rational thought in his mind insisting this couldn't be real, that exhaustion and dust had conjured some hallucination. But the light remained, steady and undeniable, casting long shadows across the ruined room, turning dust motes into swirling galaxies of gold. Thomas didn't move for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, his mind cycling through explanations that all collapsed under the weight of impossibility. Batteries, he thought desperately, some kind of mechanism triggered by touch, a trick his grandfather had rigged for reasons Thomas couldn't begin to imagine, but the light didn't flicker like electricity. It pulsed gently, organically, as though the metal itself breathed. He forced himself to crawl forward, reaching toward the cross with a trembling hand, half expecting it to burn him or explode or vanish like smoke. His fingers closed around it again, and the warmth that flooded through his palm was immediate and startling, not painful but intense, spreading up his arm like liquid sunlight. The glow intensified slightly at his touch, responding to him in a way that made his skin prickle with something between fear and wonder. Maggie had stopped barking but remained pressed against the far wall, her body rigid with uncertainty. Thomas lifted the cross closer to his face, examining it in its own light, noticing details he'd missed before. The engravings weren't random. They formed patterns that repeated, spiraling inward toward the center where the beams crossed. Words, maybe, or something like words, in a language he didn't recognize. Latin, possibly, or something older, something that predated the languages he knew. His grandfather had never been religious, had never spoken of faith or churches or anything remotely spiritual. The old man had been a practical person, grounded in tangible things like soil and timber and the simple brutality of survival. Finding something like this hidden in his cabin made no sense. It contradicted everything Thomas knew about the man, or thought he knew. He wrapped the cross carefully back in the oilcloth, watching as the light dimmed but didn't disappear entirely, a faint glow seeping through the fabric like embers refusing to die. His hands shook as he set it on a relatively clean section of floor. Questions crashed through his thoughts in waves. Where had his grandfather gotten this? Why hide it? What was it really beneath the impossible light and ancient craftsmanship? Thomas pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to steady himself, trying to think clearly through the adrenaline that made his pulse roar in his ears. Maggie crept closer, her curiosity finally overcoming her fear, and sniffed at the wrapped object with tentative caution. She looked up at Thomas, whining softly, as if asking him what they were supposed to do now. Thomas spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, continuing to clean mechanically while his mind remained locked on the cross. He couldn't leave it here, couldn't just rewrap it and hide it again as though nothing had happened. But he also couldn't explain it, couldn't walk into town carrying a glowing religious artifact and expect people to believe him or help him understand. They'd think he'd lost his mind, that the isolation of the farm and the stress of his grandfather's death had finally broken something inside him. Maybe they'd be right. He considered calling his sister Eleanor, who lived 3 hours away in Richmond, and had always been the practical one, the one who dealt with complicated problems by breaking them into manageable pieces. But how could he explain this over the phone? How could he make her understand without sounding delusional? By evening, he had made a decision, or rather, the decision had made itself through sheer necessity. He would take the cross home to the farmhouse, research it somehow, try to find someone who might know what it was without thinking he'd gone insane. Historians, maybe, or archaeologists, people who dealt with ancient objects and strange discoveries. He wrapped it more securely in clean cloth from his truck, placing it carefully in an old leather satchel his grandfather had used for carrying tools. The glow had faded to almost nothing now, just the faintest shimmer when he touched it, like heat lightning on a distant horizon. Maggie followed him closely as they left the cabin, her body pressed against his leg, seeking reassurance or offering it, he couldn't tell which. The drive back to the main farmhouse took only 8 minutes along the rutted dirt road, but it felt longer, every bump and jostle making Thomas glance nervously at the satchel on the passenger seat. The sun hung low and orange over the fields, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. His farmhouse sat modest and worn at the end of the drive, a 2-story structure his great-grandfather had built in 1943, solid but showing its age in peeling paint and sagging gutters. Thomas had lived here alone since his divorce 4 years ago, finding a strange comfort in the solitude that once terrified him. Now that solitude felt different, heavier, as though the cross had shifted something fundamental in the atmosphere around him. Inside, he placed the satchel on the kitchen table, staring at it while Maggie drank noisily from her water bowl. The light through the window turned golden, then pink, then deep blue as night approached. Thomas made coffee he didn't drink and stood at the window, watching fireflies begin their slow dance across the darkening fields. His phone sat on the counter, silent and accusing, reminding him he could call someone, could reach out, could stop carrying this alone. But something held him back, a sense that this discovery was meant for him specifically, that his grandfather had hidden it for reasons Thomas needed to understand before bringing anyone else into it. He thought about the old man, about the stories he'd never told, the past he'd kept locked away as tightly as that stone in the fireplace. What had he been protecting? What had he known? Thomas finally opened the satchel as full darkness settled outside, pulling the wrapped cross onto the table. He unwrapped it slowly, and the moment his skin made contact, the light returned, stronger this time, filling the kitchen with that impossible golden radiance. Maggie lifted her head, watching but no longer afraid, as though she'd accepted this new strangeness into their world. Thomas held the cross with both hands, feeling warmth spread through his chest, and for the first time since finding it, he felt something beyond fear and confusion. He felt cold, as though the object itself was trying to communicate something urgent and necessary, something his grandfather had understood and carried in silence until his death. Thomas took a deep breath, steadying himself against the weight of whatever came next. If you've made it this far in the story, I'd love to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button and become part of our community where we explore the unexplainable and the extraordinary hidden in everyday lives. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you do if you found something impossible in a place you thought you knew? Would you hide it, seek answers, or trust that it found you for a reason? Your thoughts matter here, and I read every single one. Thomas barely slept that night. The cross sat on his nightstand, wrapped again but still emanating that faint, persistent glow that seeped through the cloth like moonlight through curtains. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt its presence, not threatening exactly, but insistent, like someone standing quietly in a room waiting to be acknowledged. Maggie curled at the foot of his bed, occasionally lifting her head to stare at the wrapped object, her ears twitching at sounds Thomas couldn't hear. When dawn finally broke, pale and hesitant through his bedroom window, he felt exhausted but strangely alert, as though something inside him had been slowly waking throughout the night, responding to whatever energy the cross carried. He spent the morning online, searching desperately through historical databases, religious artifact catalogues, archaeological forums, anything that might give him context for what he'd found. Most of what he discovered felt useless. Generic information about medieval crosses and Catholic reliquaries, nothing that matched the strange symbols or the impossible light. He typed variations of glowing cross, ancient religious artifacts, unexplained luminescence, feeling more foolish with each search. The results ranged from academic papers too dense to pass quickly, to conspiracy websites claiming everything from alien technology to government cover-ups. None of it felt right. None of it explained the specific weight of what sat wrapped on his kitchen table, the way it responded to his touch like something alive and aware. By noon, Thomas decided he needed help. Someone he could trust who wouldn't immediately dismiss him. He thought of Father Marcus, the elderly priest who ran St. Catherine's in town, a man who'd known his grandfather decades ago when the old man still occasionally attended church, before whatever darkness claimed him drove him into isolation. Thomas had met Father Marcus only a handful of times, mostly at community events, but the priest had always struck him as someone who listened more than he judged, who carried a quiet wisdom that came from years of hearing confessions and bearing witness to human complexity. If anyone might understand, or at least not think him crazy, it would be Father Marcus. Thomas wrapped the cross carefully in a canvas bag, securing it so the glow wouldn't be visible, and drove the 43 minutes into town. Maggie sat in the passenger seat, her presence comforting in its steadiness. The town of Millbrook stretched small and familiar along the main road, a collection of brick buildings and tired storefronts that had looked exactly the same for the past 30 years. St. Catherine's sat at the north end, a modest stone church with a copper steeple turned green with age, surrounded by oak trees that had witnessed a century of prayers and doubts and desperate hopes. Thomas parked in the empty lot, his stomach tight with nervousness, and walked toward the parish office attached to the church's east side, Maggie trotting faithfully beside him. Father Marcus answered the door himself, a thin man in his mid-70s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He smiled warmly, though surprise flickered across his face. "Thomas, isn't it? Henry's grandson." His voice carried the faint remnants of an Irish accent, softened by decades in Virginia. Thomas nodded, suddenly unsure how to begin, how to explain why he'd come without sounding unhinged. Father Marcus seemed to sense his hesitation and stepped back, gesturing him inside. "Come in, son. You look like you're carrying something heavy." The words felt more literal than the priest probably intended. They sat in a small, cluttered office that smelled of old books and coffee, sunlight filtering weakly through dusty windows. Maggie settled at Thomas's feet, her chin resting on his boot. Thomas placed the canvas bag on the desk between them, his hands shaking slightly. "I found something," he began, his voice rough, "in my grandfather's cabin, something I can't explain." Father Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression neutral but attentive, giving Thomas space to continue. "I don't know what it is or where it came from, but it's not normal, it's not natural." He paused, aware of how insane he sounded. "It glows. When I touch it, it lights up." Father Marcus didn't laugh or dismiss him. Instead, his eyes sharpened with something that looked like recognition, or maybe concern. "Show me," he said simply. Thomas unwrapped the cross slowly, and the moment the cloth fell away, the object began its impossible illumination. Gentle at first, then growing stronger as Thomas's fingers brushed its surface. The golden light filled the small office, casting long shadows across walls lined with theological texts and faded photographs. Father Marcus inhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair as though physically struck. His face had gone pale, and his hands gripped the armrests tightly. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at the glowing cross with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read, something between awe and fear and profound sadness. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Dear God, where exactly did you find this?" Thomas explained the hidden alcove, the stone in the fireplace, the way Maggie had led him to it. Father Marcus listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving the cross. When Thomas finished, the priest stood slowly, walking to the window as though needing distance from what lay on his desk. He was quiet for so long that Thomas began to worry he'd made a terrible mistake coming here. Finally, Father Marcus turned back, his face composed but serious. "Your grandfather never told you about his time in Europe, did he? During the war?" Thomas shook his head, confused. His grandfather had served in World War II, he knew that much. But the old man never spoke about it, never shared stories or memories. Father Marcus sighed heavily. Henry found something during the war, something he was never supposed to find. The priest returned to his desk, sitting down heavily, as though the weight of what he was about to say pressed physically on him. In 1944, Henry's unit liberated a small monastery in southern Germany. Most of it had been destroyed, but there was a vault beneath the chapel that had survived. Inside, they found artifacts the monks had been protecting for centuries. Religious relics, sacred objects, things of immense historical and spiritual significance. Father Marcus gestured toward the cross. That was one of them. The monks called it the Cross of Radiance. According to the records, it dated back to the 6th century, possibly earlier. It was said to have been blessed by a saint whose name has been lost to time, and it was believed to carry divine light, a physical manifestation of grace. Thomas felt his chest tighten, his mind struggling to process this. But why would my grandfather keep it? Why hide it? Father Marcus's expression grew darker. Because the church wanted it back. The military wanted it studied. Collectors wanted it for museums or private collections. Your grandfather believed none of them understood what it truly was, what it represented. He thought they would treat it as a curiosity, a prize, rather than something sacred. So he kept it hidden, carried it home in secret, and spent the rest of his life protecting it from those who would misuse it or exploit it. The priest leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Thomas, this is not just an artifact. If what the monks believed is true, this cross carries something powerful, something that responds to faith, to intention, to the soul of whoever holds it." Thomas looked down at the glowing object in his hands, feeling its warmth pulse gently against his palms. "What am I supposed to do with it?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. Father Marcus was quiet for a moment, then reached across the desk and placed his weathered hand over Thomas's. "That's not for me to decide," he said gently. "Your grandfather protected it for 79 years. He chose not to pass it to the church, not to reveal it to anyone. He kept it hidden until his death, and somehow, intentionally or not, he left it for you to find. That means something, Thomas. That means you have a choice to make, a responsibility to carry. But you don't have to carry it alone." Thomas sat in silence, Father Marcus's words settling over him like a weight he wasn't sure he could bear. The cross continued its gentle illumination, casting shifting patterns across the priest's desk, and for the first time since finding it, Thomas felt the full magnitude of what had been placed in his hands. This wasn't just an object. It was a legacy, a burden his grandfather had carried in secret for decades, protecting it from a world that would have torn it apart, trying to understand or possess it. And now that burden had passed to him, whether he wanted it or not, whether he felt worthy of it or not, he looked up at Father Marcus, searching the old priest's face for guidance, for certainty, for anything that might make this decision easier. But Father Marcus only watched him with patient compassion, understanding that some choices cannot be made by anyone except the person standing at the crossroads. "My grandfather never struck me as a particularly faithful man," Thomas said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "He didn't go to church, didn't pray, at least not that I ever saw. He was hard, distant, like he'd closed himself off from everything soft or hopeful in the world. Father Marcus nodded slowly, a sad smile touching his lips. Faith takes many forms, Thomas. Sometimes the most faithful among us are those who carry their burdens in silence, who protect what is sacred, even when it costs them connection, peace, even love. Your grandfather's faith wasn't in rituals or doctrines. It was in preservation, in keeping something wholly safe from a world that had proven itself capable of destroying anything beautiful or pure. That kind of faith is lonely. It isolates, but it is no less real. The words struck something deep in Thomas's chest, a recognition of the loneliness he'd always sensed in his grandfather, the way the old man had seemed to exist behind glass, visible but unreachable. He thought about the cabin, the decades of solitude, the way his grandfather had pushed family away not out of cruelty, but perhaps out of necessity, understanding that closeness meant risk, meant the possibility of secrets being discovered. Thomas felt a surge of unexpected grief for the man he'd never truly known, for the weight his grandfather had carried without ever asking for help or understanding. He must have been terrified, Thomas whispered, more to himself than to Father Marcus. Terrified that someone would find it, that he'd fail in the one thing he'd committed his life to protecting. Father Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I spoke with Henry a few times over the years, usually at community gatherings he couldn't avoid. He never mentioned the cross, of course, but there was always something haunted in his eyes, something unfinished. I think he wanted to tell someone, wanted to share the burden, but he'd carried it alone for so long that he no longer knew how. The priest paused, studying Thomas carefully. Now you have to decide what comes next. You can bring it to the church, let scholars and theologians examine it, try to verify its history and significance. You can keep it hidden as your grandfather did, becoming its next guardian, or you can destroy it, release yourself from the responsibility entirely. The third option sent a shock through Thomas. The idea of destroying something so ancient, so impossibly beautiful, felt almost blasphemous. Yet he understood the appeal, the seductive simplicity of ending the burden before it consumed him the way it had consumed his grandfather. He looked down at the cross, watching the light pulse beneath his fingers, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose, of being connected to something larger than his small, ordinary life. The divorce, the struggling farm, the quiet desperation that had defined his last few years, all of it suddenly felt less suffocating in the presence of this inexplicable thing. Maybe that was dangerous. Maybe that was exactly how his grandfather had been trapped, finding meaning in protection and losing everything else in the process. "What do you think I should do?" Thomas asked, needing to hear someone else's perspective, even knowing the decision ultimately rested with him. Father Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, as though weighing words carefully before offering them. "I think you should take time," he said finally. "Don't make this decision in fear or confusion. Live with it for a while. Pray if you're inclined. Reflect on what it means to you, what your grandfather might have wanted, what your own life needs. The cross has waited centuries. It can wait a few more weeks or months, while you find clarity." He reached out and gently closed Thomas's hands around the object. "But I will say this, objects of power, whether divine or simply human-made, have a way of revealing who we truly are. They test us, challenge us, force us to confront parts of ourselves we've avoided. Whatever you decide, make sure it comes from the truest part of who you are, not from fear or obligation or what others expect." Thomas nodded slowly, carefully wrapping the cross again, watching as the light dimmed but didn't disappear entirely. He placed it back in the canvas bag, feeling the weight of it differently now, less like a burden and more like a question waiting for an answer. Father Marcus walked him to the door, placing a hand on his shoulder. "If you need guidance, if you need someone to talk to, my door is always open. Your grandfather walked this path alone, but you don't have to." Thomas thanked him, his throat tight with gratitude and uncertainty, and walked back to his truck where Maggie waited patiently. The drive home felt longer, the afternoon sun harsh and bright after the dim comfort of Father Marcus's office. Thomas's mind churned with possibilities and fears, imagining futures where he kept the cross hidden, where he revealed it to the world, where he passed it on to someone else more capable or faithful. Each path seemed to carry consequences he couldn't fully foresee, risks and sacrifices that made his stomach clench with anxiety. Maggie rested her head on his thigh as he drove, her presence grounding him, reminding him that some things remained simple and steady, even when everything else felt uncertain. When he pulled into his driveway, the farmhouse looked exactly as he'd left it, solid and familiar, waiting patiently for him to decide who he wanted to be. That evening, Thomas sat on his porch as twilight gathered, the cross unwrapped on the small table beside him, glowing softly in the growing darkness. Fireflies rose from the fields like earthbound stars, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called its lonely, repetitive song. Thomas touched the cross lightly, feeling its warmth spread through his hand, and for the first time since finding it, he allowed himself to simply sit with it. No questions, no plans, just presence. The light pulsed gently, and Thomas closed his eyes, breathing deeply, letting the strange peace of the moment settle into his bones. Maybe this was what his grandfather had felt, these quiet moments of connection with something beyond understanding, something that asked nothing except to be witnessed and protected. Maybe this was enough. The days that followed took on a strange rhythm, ordinary in their surface details, but transformed by the presence of the cross. Thomas returned to his work on the farm, repairing fences, tending to the small vegetable garden he maintained, mostly out of stubbornness, clearing more debris from the cabin. But every evening, he found himself drawn back to the cross, sitting with it as darkness fell, letting its light fill the quiet spaces of his home. He began to notice things he'd overlooked before, the way Maggie seemed calmer in its presence, the way his own anxious thoughts settled into something more manageable when he held it. The insomnia that had plagued him since the divorce eased, replaced by deep, dreamless sleep that left him feeling restored rather than exhausted. He started reading, something he hadn't done in years, pulling dusty books from shelves his grandfather had left behind. History mostly, accounts of World War II, biographies of soldiers and monks, and ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. He found himself searching for his grandfather in those pages, trying to understand the young man who had stumbled upon something sacred in the ruins of war and made the impossible decision to keep it hidden. Thomas discovered a small journal tucked inside one of the books, his grandfather's handwriting cramped and faded across yellowed pages. The entries were sparse, cryptic, but one passage stood out, written in 1972. 28 years I've kept it safe. 28 years of wondering if I did right. Some days I think I saved something precious. Other days I think I only saved it from being understood, from fulfilling whatever purpose it was meant for, but I can't let it go. Not to people who would lock it away or display it like a trophy. It chose me somehow, and I have to believe that means something. Thomas read that passage over and over, feeling the echo of his grandfather's doubt and determination. The old man had carried this secret for 51 more years after writing those words, never wavering, never seeking absolution or validation. That kind of commitment awed Thomas, but it also terrified him. He didn't know if he possessed that strength, that certainty. His life had been marked by compromises and failures, a marriage that crumbled, a career he'd abandoned, dreams he'd let slip away without fighting. How could someone like him be trusted with something so significant? Yet here it was, glowing softly on his kitchen table, responding to his touch as though recognizing something in him he couldn't see in himself. One morning, nearly 3 weeks after finding the cross, Thomas woke to find Maggie sitting alert by the bedroom window, her body tense with attention. He followed her gaze and saw a car he didn't recognize parked at the end of his long driveway, a dark sedan with tinted windows that seemed deliberately anonymous. His heart quickened with immediate anxiety. He'd told no one except Father Marcus, and the priest had promised discretion. Thomas dressed quickly, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them comforting. By the time he made it downstairs, someone was knocking at his front door, firm and insistent. Maggie growled low in her throat, positioning herself between Thomas and the door. Thomas opened it cautiously, finding a woman in her early 50s standing on his porch, dressed in dark professional clothes that seemed out of place in the rural setting. Her expression was neutral but evaluating, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. "Thomas Whitman?" she asked, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't quite place. European, perhaps, but polished smooth by years elsewhere. He nodded warily, not inviting her in. She offered a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My name is Dr. Castellano. I represent a private organization dedicated to preserving religious artifacts of historical significance. I understand you may have come into possession of an object that falls within our purview." Thomas felt his blood run cold. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Dr. Castellano's smile tightened slightly. "Mr. Whitman, your grandfather acquired something during the war, something that has been sought after for many decades. We're not here to take it by force or create problems for you. We simply wish to verify its existence and discuss the possibility of proper preservation. This object, if it's what we believe it is, deserves to be studied, protected by experts who understand its historical and spiritual value." Thomas's grip on the doorframe tightened. "My grandfather protected it for 79 years. That tells me he didn't trust your organization or anyone like you to understand what it truly is." "Doctor." Castellano's expression hardened slightly, the veneer of politeness cracking just enough to reveal something colder beneath. "Your grandfather was one man, acting on emotion and wartime trauma. This artifact belongs to history, to scholarship, to the faithful who might draw meaning from it. Keeping it hidden serves no one." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest, protective and fierce. "It serves the purpose my grandfather believed in, and now it's my responsibility to honor that." "Doctor." Castellano studied him for a long moment, then reached into her jacket and produced a business card, extending it toward him. "If you change your mind, if you decide you'd rather not carry this burden alone, contact us. We can offer security, financial compensation, the assurance that it will be treated with reverence." Thomas didn't take the card. After another tense moment, she placed it on the porch railing and walked back to her car. He watched until she drove away, his hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. Inside, Thomas went straight to the cross, unwrapping it with trembling fingers. The moment he touched it, the light flared brighter than he'd ever seen, almost blinding, filling the entire room with golden radiance. Maggie pressed against his leg, and Thomas felt something shift inside him, a clarity cutting through his doubt. His grandfather had been right. This wasn't meant for organizations or institutions or people who measured value in historical significance and scholarly analysis. This was something personal, something that required relationship rather than study, faith rather than understanding. Thomas didn't know what the cross truly was, didn't know if the light came from divine blessing or some natural phenomenon beyond current science. But he knew with absolute certainty that it had been meant for him to find, that his grandfather had trusted him across decades and death to make the right choice. He spent that evening writing, documenting everything he knew about the cross, his grandfather's history, Father Marcus's revelations, the visit from Dr. Castellano. He sealed the document in an envelope addressed to his sister, to be opened only if something happened to him. Then he took the cross and walked into the fields behind his farmhouse, Maggie trotting beside him, until they reached a small grove of oak trees he'd loved since childhood. He sat beneath the largest tree, the cross cradled in his hands, and he prayed for the first time in years. Not formal prayers from childhood liturgy, but simple, honest words, asking for guidance, for strength, for the wisdom to be worthy of what he'd been given. The cross glowed steadily, And as Thomas sat in the gathering darkness, he felt a peace settle over him that he'd never experienced before. He thought of his grandfather, of the lonely decades spent protecting this sacred thing, and he made a silent promise. He would carry it forward, not in isolation as the old man had, but with connection, with purpose, with the understanding that some burdens become lighter when we accept them fully rather than resisting them. Thomas didn't know what the future held, didn't know if more people would come searching, if he would face harder choices, greater dangers. But sitting there beneath ancient trees, with his faithful dog beside him, and impossible light warming his hands, he felt ready. Ready to be the guardian his grandfather had always hoped he could be. Thank you for joining me on Thomas's journey. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think about faith, legacy, or the burdens we carry, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel. We're building a community here of people who believe that the extraordinary hides in the ordinary, that our lives contain more meaning than we often recognize. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone searching for their own light in the darkness. And I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what you learned from Thomas's story. Have you ever inherited something that changed how you saw yourself or your family? Have you ever had to choose between safety and purpose? Your stories matter, and this community grows richer every time you share them. Until next time, remember that sometimes the things we find are really finding us, calling us toward the people we were always meant to become.